Yeah. So I moved to the United States when I was just 3 years old. I lived in a suburb for about 2 years, and then I moved to Roscommon, which is the rural village mentioned in the question. And while we were there, because I was so young, I really felt like I had a typical American childhood. I didn't really recognize the fact that I was different than my peers, that I was Muslim, Arab, growing up in a place where we were the only family with those identities. So, I had a typical childhood. We spent all seasons outdoors. And it wasn't really until I grew a bit older that I began to realize that I was a little bit different than my peers. And I had identities that they didn't share. And I started to feel a little bit of shame around my Muslim identity in particular, just with the events of 9 11 and the Iraq War. And it took me a long time to kind of reconcile those beliefs and learn how to hold both my American identities with my Muslim immigrant Arab identities. But overall, growing up in rural Michigan, it actually gave me a great perspective because I grew up around people who were different than me, and I feel like that has actually helped me in my legal career. I've had a long history of having to explain my viewpoints to people who disagree with me, and speak with people who hold different identities, different backgrounds, and so I actually see it as an asset. And yeah. Yeah, so I went and volunteered in Lesbos, Greece in 2018 with an organization called Movement on the Ground. I initially went just for a month, but I ended up extending my stay for another month. And I was the resident volunteer coordinator for this organization, which meant that if there were residents within the camps, we would ask them if they wanted to volunteer in managing the camp. So we ran kitchens, we ran a clothing store, and we would find and recruit refugees to help run the tasks because one of the hardest things for refugees who are in limbo for such a long period of time is not having anything to do every single day. There's no work, they're not allowed to leave the camp to explore the town. There's a lot of hostility towards them. So they're confined to the borders of the camp with nothing to do. So we would recruit volunteers and have them help us manage the kitchens, the clothing store, some classes that we would provide. And even though I went to Lesbos, Greece in 2018, there were still boats arriving on the island. The camps were incredibly overcrowded. I worked primarily in two camps. Moria Refugee Camp, which has over 10,000 people, and Karatepe Refugee Camp, which was a smaller camp. It held a couple of thousand people, and anyone who was doubly persecuted, so any family or any individual who was in Moria and persecuted once again, would be removed from that camp and put into Karatepe Refugee Camp. And just considering the conditions, we were primarily in Karatepe Refugee Camp because the work that we did in Moria was more so helping set up tents and visiting the unaccompanied minors and playing games. There wasn't a lot of development that we could do inside of Moria just because it was so overcrowded. So most of my work was spent in Karatepe Refugee Camp, doing that resident coordinator position. Like I mentioned, Karatepe Refugee Camp was actually the camp that housed the refugees who were persecuted even on the island. And because of that, a lot of the refugees in Karatepe Refugee Camp were Yazidi. Because Yazidis are an incredibly small population. The Yazidis that I worked with were primarily Iraqi, and they were in Greece because of the Sinjar massacre and the after effects. And they had left Iraq because of that, and so they found that a lot of the persecution that they were facing, that they had faced in Iraq based on their religious beliefs primarily, um, they were facing that once again in Moria camp. So, in particular, there was one family that I worked with, and we had just been talking. They speak Arabic, and I speak Arabic, and so they were sharing their story with me. And the mother, she was pregnant. She had told me that when she had arrived in Moria refugee camp, because it's so crowded, they actually share the tents with other families, and they were sharing it with a non-Yazidi family. And she came home one day, and they told her that if she didn't leave by the end of the day, she would find her husband's head on her lawn. And so you have these Yazidis who have escaped persecution only to find that same persecution in the camp because it's so overcrowded, the tensions are running high, and it's kind of a microcosm of the issues that people faced back home. And that was just one of the individuals that I worked with. There were plenty, a lot of them were actually youth. They were around the same age as my brother, 15 years old, 16 years old. And so I got along really well with them. And I found that being Iraqi myself, I had a lot more in common with them than I had expected. When I went to Turkey, I went with an organization called the Kerem Foundation, which primarily works with Syrian refugees. And the Kerem Foundation is less focused on they're more focused on sustainable aid, the long-term solutions to the problems that refugee face, particularly education. And so one of their main programs is running innovation centers. They're called Kadam houses, where they provide incredible design-based programming to Syrian refugees. So they partner with a school in Boston called Nuvu Studios, and they provide students with these workshops where they equip them with um, architecture skills, drawing skills, design based thinking skills. In order to prepare them for a future in university and to provide them with opportunities that even I as an American student would be grateful to have. So when I was there, I was working with the communications team of Kadam Foundation, and I was primarily interviewing the Syrian students to learn more about their stories so that we could share the stories of our students with the larger world and all of their accomplishments and really highlight their resilience. So I conducted about 40 interviews with Syrians aged like 14 to 18 years old, but also conducted some. We also provide students who are older than 18 with like higher education scholarships. So interviewed some of those students as well. So the work that I did there was a lot more information gathering, and I learned a lot. It contrasted with my work in Greece because my work in Greece was a lot about immediate need and providing refugees with basic needs, whereas my work in Turkey was more about, now that refugees are in the place that they're going to be resettled in for a long time, how can we provide them with a better future and opportunities to provide for themselves outside of their basic needs? Yeah, I think this is a hard question to answer because my answer depends on what you're comparing the conditions to. And so, because I had gone from Greece, where individuals weren't getting access to shelter, people were sleeping on the streets, there was no access to food, access to toilets were rare, the sanitary conditions were horrible. When I went to Turkey, um, I was actually surprised because a lot of the refugees had access to apartments. A lot of refugees had shelter, they had food even though it was minimal. So compared to that, I think the conditions were better. But once I kind of got out of that framework and just started considering like how is this person's condition of life, how are their conditions in general compared to mine, the conditions are not all that great. Turkey has accepted a lot of Syrian refugees, and for that reason there's a lot of hostility, but there's also a lot of refugees who are, they still don't have legal status. They're still experiencing poverty. One of the Cudham Foundation's programs actually works on getting kids out of child labor. And so they're forced to work in these conditions that are not ideal. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think if I had to choose one word to describe the Trump administration's immigration policy, would really be exclusion. I think the administration has based its immigration policy on the premise that the less people we accept, the better. And so there have been a lot of policies that have been put in place that are designed to keep refugees and immigrants from entering the nation, which really stands in contrast to our values as an American people. The Statues of Liberty, one of the icons of the United States, the quote that's inscribed on the statute says, give me your tired, your poor, your yearning masses, that want to be free, essentially. And here we are as a nation doing the exact opposite. We're turning away the poor, we're turning away immigrants, we're turning away anybody that we deem as different. So yeah. Based on my experience, the system has served refugees pretty well, but I also think it depends on the experience that the resettlement agency has. For example, I went and visited a resettlement agency in Utica, New York, and they have been resettling refugees since the Bosnian War and before. And because of that, they've developed a lot of local partners. So they've developed with partnerships with landlords, and so they're able to provide refugees with apartments at a cheap rate. They have develop partnerships with schools. So when refugees want to enroll into school or enroll their children into school, the agency already has a system and procedure for how to do that. And so I think it depends really on the resettlement agency's relationships with the local community, because these agencies aren't government run. They're a lot of them are nonprofit organizations, and so it really depends on how well that agency is integrated into the community. And so the agencies that I've worked with in Pittsburgh, in Michigan, in New York, I've seen them to be incredibly helpful to refugees. Do I think it's enough? Not necessarily. I think there need to be more resources dedicated to refugees, but I think it's a good start in helping orient refugees to the American life. One of the first immigration policies in the United States back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, actually had whiteness as a prerequisite for citizenship. And even though that was later removed, we still see whiteness as a prerequisite for citizenship throughout the 1800s and honestly into today. So we see it in the 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We saw it in the way with which Native Americans and indigenous communities were treated. We also see it, you can't talk about whiteness without talking about the racial hierarchy that the United States has created with Black individuals, and with the institution of slavery. And so in the 1800s, the courts were really grappling with how do we define whiteness? How do we define a concept that's not scientific? And so they created these racial categories to kind of ensure that individuals who are deemed white, primarily like Northern, Western, Eastern Europeans, um, would be part of that higher part of the hierarchy, and then everybody else who is deemed different. So Native Americans, Chinese Americans, Black Americans, they would all be part of the lower hierarchy that was not qualified as white. So that's what our immigration policy really focused on was confining immigration to include individuals who could be deemed as white. And I think we're seeing that today, where religion kind of is being racialized. We have Muslim refugees who want to enter the nation who are, in fact, Caucasian, but who are not being allowed to enter because they're racialized into this category of the other, which has included other minority populations. So I don't think that there should be a distinction. I don't think there is such a thing between well deserving and deserving, not deserving. I mean, the truth is that these people are all fleeing the same conditions. They're fleeing war. They're fleeing poverty. They are persecuted. We see with asylum applications that individuals have to demonstrate a specific fear. They have to show that the fear is specific to them, to their person, to their family. But I don't think that that specificity, while I do think it while I do think that it introduces a unique set of challenges to that individual in their life in their home country, I don't think that they are more deserving of a safe place to live than somebody who experiences a more general fear of persecution. the reality is that at the end of the day, every human being, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Life, deserves, they have a right to shelter, they have a right to citizenship, they have a right to a variety of things that people in these places are not given access to. And so I think what we need to focus on is how do we ensure that every human being has those rights, regardless of whether or not we consider them to be deserving or undeserving. It's more about what rights are we going to ensure that people have access to, and who are those rights going to be given to. And I think the answer is to everyone. There should be no distinction between who is deserving of those rights. Yeah. So on the U.S. Mexico border, individuals used to be able to seek asylum legally within the United States. They used to be able to enter our borders. But with the Trump administration, people who are seeking to enter the United States on the southern border have been forced to stay in Mexico, even if they're not Mexican, and conduct interviews from tents and do a lot of their cases from Mexico. And we see a lot of people being held in detention centers recently, and these detention centers were incredibly overcrowded before the COVID pandemic. And so now, with the COVID pandemic, the conditions, people are getting sick. Recently, in our news cycle, there was a lot of talk about the around 400 children who were separated from their parents, and people are unable to find these parents. And so now you have children who are completely innocent, but who are unable to be reunited with their families. And I think, again, the policies on the US Mexico border are also based on this idea of exclusion and this idea of, if we can keep people out, they're not going to want to come in. And so the policies don't necessarily consider the human, they just consider how can we keep people out at all costs, which has resulted in incredibly degrading and inhumane conditions where people don't have access to water, they don't have access to beds. Um, there's tens of people in the same room. They're not allowed to communicate with family. It's just incredibly devastating. Yeah, this is such a big question. There could be so much done. I think from the US perspective, from the American perspective, the first thing, the easiest thing that can be done is the president. The president has the authority to decide the number of refugees that are entered into the United States. And the president has the authority to decide how many refugees enter the United States. And so, one of the things that we can do is raise that number back up. So, that number used to be around 50,000, 60,000, 70, 80,000. But when Trump came into office, he lowered that number down to around 15,000. And we've accepted less refugees than that. And so, worldwide, what we see is a trend of people decreasing the number of refugees that are accepted into their borders. And so the first thing that we can do is continue to advocate for allowing refugees to enter into our countries, whether that's Germany, the United States. The second thing I think that we can do to improve conditions is not settle on the standard that we have today. So I think a lot of people, because we've had refugees living in camps for a long time, they think that these conditions are quote unquote normal. But when you travel to these places, you really see that no human being should be forced to live in the conditions in Moria refugee camp. So another thing that we can do is dedicate more resources to these places. So the reality of the situation is that as long as there is war and as long as there is violence, refugees they're not going to disappear. And so we need to develop systems where adequate resources are being dedicated to the places in which refugees are fleeing to. So to me, that looks like access to shelter, access to education. Even if you're in Greece, even if you're still in on your journey, you're still migrating to another country. It looks like dedicating more resources so that we're not forcing people to live in truly deplorable conditions. I think another thing that can be done, which would be honestly the answer to the root problem, is work more on development, and consider the ways in which our country's actions have implications on another country. And so I'm thinking of the United States in particular when we invaded Iraq in the early 2000s. That had devastating consequences for millions of Iraqis who have now been displaced across the world. And so we as a nation have to ask ourselves, what is our role in resettling refugees and in taking in migrants who have been displaced as a result of our actions? We have to ask ourselves that question as governments. But we also have to, I think, push for more equitable development, sustainable development, so that we can answer the reasons why people are fleeing. A lot of people are fleeing because of poverty and crime, and if we can answer those problems through development, I mean, I think we'll see a decrease in resettlement, because at the end of the day, nobody really wants to leave their home, and we have to work to ensure that the places that people call home are safe places. Definitely. So when I was an undergraduate student, in 2013 to 2017, one of my good friends had the idea to set up an organization called the Michigan Refugee Assistance Program, that connected university students with local refugee families, because a lot of refugee families, when they arrive, they don't necessarily feel culturally oriented to the city, and there's a lot of isolation because they're put in communities where they know nobody. And so the idea was to be able to connect students to families, and kind of give them a connection to the surrounding community. So I personally was partnered with one other student, and we visited a family in Detroit and asked them, we had specific topics that we were supposed to discuss. So one week we discussed grocery stores and like what grocery stores they had been visiting. Another week we discussed banks and had they been visiting any banks, to kind of see where we could help in their cultural orientation to the United States. The organization also conducted educational events on campus, because we recognize that a lot of the fear that comes around refugees comes from a lack of education. And so there was programming around education for the student body, but also the wider community. Yeah, so I'm currently a second year law student, which means after this, I have one more year and then I have completed my education. And so after I graduate, I would love to be able to go back to Greece, and provide legal aid to refugees on the ground and help them with their resettlement cases, and do that for a few years, whether it's in Greece or elsewhere. I'm not sure. But after I do that and really gain an understanding of the legal barriers that refugees are facing on the ground, and gain a better understanding of the technicalities of the resettlement system and of refugee resettlement at large, I would love to be able to go into policy, and advocate for a refugee system that is not so reactionary and that is more preventative, that takes into account the fact that we have 70 million people displaced across the world, and that takes into account that that number is probably going to increase with climate refugees. And so, really pushing for solutions that are creative, that are innovative, and address the needs of the people on the ground.